Close your eyes and imagine an empire on the edge of collapse. Cities crumble, borders shrink, enemies circle like wolves, and in the middle of this rising darkness stands a single man. A man whose loyalty reshaped continents. A man whose victories rebuilt an empire that had already begun to die. A man history almost forgot, but whose name once echoed from Constantinople to the sands of North Africa. His name was Belisarius. Let your mind drift back 17 centuries, to a time when Rome had split into two worlds, the ancient West, flickering like a dying flame, and the Eastern Empire, wealthy, glittering, but trembling beneath the surface. Tonight, you'll fall asleep to the life of a general born in silence, raised in the shadows, and destined to command the greatest armies of his age. A man so brilliant that even his enemies believed he was chosen by fate. A man so loyal that legends say he refused to betray his emperor even when that emperor betrayed him first. This is the story of Belisarius. Breathe slowly. The world around you fades, and the world of late antiquity opens. The beginning. A boy from Thrace. Before Belisarius became the guardian of an empire, he was simply a boy from the rugged plains of Thrace, a frontier land where soldiers were born from necessity, not ambition. The wind there carried the voices of past battles. Villagers grew up understanding hardship. Young Belisarius learned quickly that strength was survival, and discipline was destiny. No one knows the exact details of his childhood, but historians agree on one thing. From a young age, he carried a quiet fire inside him, a calm intensity, a focus that would someday make him the most trusted warrior of Emperor Justinian. As he grew older, Belisarius entered the military, not as a privileged aristocrat, not as a pampered noble, but as a soldier who earned every step forward. He began serving in the elite guard of the Eastern Empire, a unit that protected the emperor himself. Even in the chaos of battle, Belisarius moved like he was born for the storm. He studied tactics. He noticed what others ignored. He understood the rhythm of war, the way armies breathed, advanced, hesitated. Leaders saw potential, and fate opened its first door. The rise of Justinian, an emperor who needed a weapon. When Justinian ascended the throne, he dreamed of restoring the entire Roman world. But dreams are fragile without the right hands to carry them. He needed someone who was brave, but not reckless, brilliant, but not ambitious, powerful, but loyal beyond question. He found that man in Belisarius. In Belisarius, Justinian saw an unstoppable instrument, a general who could conquer lands yet remain humble in victory, a commander who could silence rebellions, defend borders, and revive Rome's faded glory. And so, the emperor forged a partnership that would change the shape of the Mediterranean. The Persian front, where heroes are tempered. Belisarius's first major test came on the eastern frontier against the relentless Sasanian Empire. The Persians were fierce, ancient rivals of Rome, masters of cavalry, archery, and strategy. At Dara, a dusty fortress town near the Persian border, Belisarius faced an enemy twice the size of his own force. The wind blew hot across the plains. The soldiers knew the odds, but their young commander had a plan. Belisarius didn't rely on brute strength. He relied on geometry, the mathematics of war. He positioned his men in angled lines to trap Persian cavalry. He dug hidden trenches to break enemy charges. He orchestrated the battlefield like a grand design, and when the Persians attacked, the ground swallowed them. Dara became a masterpiece, a victory so astonishing that stories of it traveled far beyond the empire's borders. Belisarius had passed his trial. He had become the empire's rising star. But his greatest challenges had not yet begun. The city that burned with rage returned to your breath. Slow, steady. Because the next chapter of this story brings us into the heart of Constantinople, a city on the brink of exploding. In the year 532, the capital didn't just simmer with anger, it boiled. Political factions battled in the streets. Riots turned into uprisings. and soon flames engulfed entire districts. It became known as the Nika Revolt, one of the most violent urban uprisings in ancient history. The empire teetered. Justinian considered fleeing. The throne trembled beneath him. And then, Belisarius entered the scene. With a calm voice and a sharpened mind, he crafted a strategy to end the chaos. He led troops through narrow streets, striking fast, breaking the rebellion at its heart. The revolt collapsed. The city quieted. The throne was saved, and once again, Belisarius was the shield of the empire. But Justinian did not thank him with rest. The emperor's dream was expanding. The map of the Mediterranean whispered with possibilities. The old Western Empire lay fractured. North Africa under the Vandals, Italy fractured under the Ostrogoths, Spain divided, and Rome's ancient glory buried beneath new kingdoms. Justinian wanted it all back. He wanted to restore the Roman world. He wanted borders drawn by ambition, not reality. And so he turned to Belisarius once more. A new mission awaited. A mission across the sea that would test loyalty, strategy, and courage more than anything before. This is where the true legend begins. The night is quiet now. Let your breathing soften. And picture the dark waters of the Mediterranean stretching endlessly beneath the moon. A fleet of ships glides across it, silent, steady, disciplined. On the largest vessel stands a man wrapped in a simple cloak, eyes fixed on the horizon. Belisarius is leaving the safety of Constantinople for a campaign that could either resurrect an empire or sink it forever beneath the waves. This is where the story deepens. This is where the storm whispers his name, the call to North Africa. When Justinian selected Belisarius to lead the expedition against the Vandal kingdom of North Africa, many doubted the mission entirely. The Vandals were powerful. Their navy was feared. Their cavalry moved with speed unmatched in the western Mediterranean. They had ruled the rich provinces of Africa for nearly a century, holding cities like Carthage with an iron fist. But Justinian believed, perhaps with desperation, perhaps with vision, that Belisarius could achieve the impossible. Belisarius did not argue. He simply accepted, as he always did, with a calm confidence that unsettled even his enemies. To him, duty was never a burden. It was a quiet truth. The fleet sets sail. The Byzantine fleet left Constantinople in the summer of 533. 500 ships, 10,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, crewmen, sailors, officers, and Belisarius, the mind that held the entire campaign together. For days, the fleet drifted past islands, coasts, and sunlit harbors. But the sea is unpredictable, and storms tested them repeatedly. Belisarius remained composed through it all. He walked the decks calmly, speaking softly with the men, reassuring them with the steadiness of his presence. He understood something few generals did, that morale is not built in speeches, but in moments of shared hardship. As they neared Africa, the wind grew warm and heavy with desert air. The soldiers tightened their grip on their shields. They had arrived at the edge of the unknown, landing on Vandal shores. The fleet landed quietly near Caput Vada, far from the main Vandal armies. Belisarius wanted no grand entrance. He wanted surprise. He wanted time to study the land, the people, the movement of enemy forces. The men disembarked under a pale sunrise, their armor glinting faintly in the morning light. Belisarius ordered strict discipline, no looting, no harassment of locals, no arrogance. He knew that an army that behaves like an invading horde creates enemies before it ever meets its actual foes. Instead, he wanted the Africans to see Byzantine soldiers as liberators, not conquerors. This was one of his quiet genius traits. He won battles long before the fighting even began. The march to Carthage. The road to Carthage stretched across flat plains and scattered villages. As the army marched, Belisarius kept his formations tight. He placed cavalry on the flanks, scouting constantly. He studied every dust cloud on the horizon, every rumor, every whisper of Vandal movement. For the Vandals were on edge. Their king, Gelimer, was confident yet careless. He underestimated Belisarius, a mistake many would come to regret. When Vandal scouts sighted the Byzantine army, Gelimer ordered his brother Amatas to hold Carthage while he prepared the main force inland. Belisarius saw opportunity in this division. A divided enemy is a vulnerable enemy. So he marched faster. Day after day, under the African sun, the Byzantines moved with precision. Then word came, the Vandals were waiting ahead near a place called Ad Decimum. The first great clash of the African campaign was about to begin. The Battle of Ad Decimum. Picture the dry heat of the African plains. The sun sits high and sharp. Dust swirls under the hooves of cavalry. Belisarius moves calmly among his men, his voice low, almost soothing. Hold your positions. Wait for my signal. At Ad Decimum, Gelimer intended to crush the Byzantines in an ambush. 3 forces positioned themselves to strike from different angles. But the Vandals had not accounted for one truth. Belisarius saw patterns in chaos. When the battle began, Byzantine cavalry engaged Amatas's men first. In a fierce clash, Amatas was killed. The Vandal lines wavered. Another Vandal force, led by Gibamund, charged in from the flank, only to be struck down by Belisarius's disciplined cavalry. The ambush had turned against the ambushers, and when Gelimer finally arrived with the main force, he expected victory, but found confusion, defeat, and tragedy. At the sight of his brother's body, Gelimer hesitated. For a single devastating moment, he grieved. Belisarius did not waste that moment. He pressed forward, and the Vandals collapsed. The Byzantines had won. The road to Carthage was open. The fall of Carthage night had fallen by the time Belisarius approached the gates of Carthage. The city was silent. No defense. No resistance. The Vandals had fled. Belisarius entered the ancient metropolis with strict orders. No plunder, no chaos, no fire. The people of Carthage watched in astonishment as disciplined soldiers marched through their streets without harming a single home. In that moment, Belisarius did not simply conquer a city. He won its loyalty. For the first time in a century, Rome, even in its eastern form, held Carthage again. It was a victory that shook the Mediterranean. But the war was not over. Gelimer still commanded a powerful force, and the final battle was yet to come. Let your mind drift back to the warm winds of North Africa. Imagine the calm after a storm. The Byzantines resting inside the ancient walls of Carthage, the lamps flickering in narrow streets, the sea whispering against the harbor stones. Belisarius walks the ramparts alone, gazing into the darkness beyond the walls. He knows the war is not finished. He knows Gelimer, king of the Vandals, still roams the countryside with a wounded pride, gathering the remains of his once mighty kingdom. Carthage is safe for now, but the heart of Africa is still unsettled. The final clash is coming. The shadow of Gelimer. Gelimer was no ordinary foe. He was intelligent, charismatic, and deeply respected by his people. But the chaos at Ad Decimum shattered his confidence. He fled south, regrouping with loyal warriors attempting to rebuild his strength. From the hills and plains outside Carthage, the Vandals watched and waited. They hoped Belisarius would overextend, that the Byzantines would grow careless in their victory. Belisarius did not give them the chance. He strengthened the city walls. He reorganized supplies. He treated the wounded. He kept his officers disciplined and alert. And most importantly, he prepared for the final battle with patience, not haste. He understood that victory is not seized through speed alone, but through clarity. The search for the Vandal army reports arrived daily. Villagers whispered of Vandal riders passing through at night. Merchants spoke of Gelimer gathering forces inland. Scouts returned with glimpses of banners in the distance. The Vandals were regrouping near a place called Tricameron. Belisarius listened carefully to every detail. He mapped the terrain in his mind. The narrow valley, the river crossing, the ridges overlooking the plains. It was the perfect place for a final confrontation. And so, as dawn broke, Belisarius marshaled his army and set out to end the Vandal kingdom once and for all. The march to Tricameron. The march northward was steady and careful. Belisarius placed his cavalry at the forefront, his infantry in tight formations, and his scouts constantly sweeping the flanks. The African landscape rolled gently under the morning sun. Golden fields, distant hills, and the silence of a land waiting for its fate. The closer they came to Tricameron, the more tense the air became. Belisarius sensed it. His officers felt it. Even the horses seemed uneasy. A kingdom was about to rise or fall. The battle begins. When the Byzantine army reached Tricameron, they found Gelimer's forces positioned behind a river. A defensive line meant to slow the attackers. Belisarius did not hesitate. He ordered his elite cavalry, the Bucellari, to storm the enemy front. These were not ordinary horsemen. They were Belisarius's personal guard, battle-hardened, loyal, and fearless. They followed him with unwavering trust. Their charge struck with explosive force, shattering the first Vandal ranks. The river ran chaotic with splashing horses, clashing spears, shouting men. Gelimer's brother, Zazo, a fierce warrior who had returned from Sardinia, led the Vandal counterattack. Steel clashed against shields, dust swirled into the sky. The rhythms of battle echoed across the valley. It was a brutal struggle. But Belisarius kept his composure. He directed the battle with calm precision, his voice steady amidst the chaos. And then, a cry rose above the battlefield. Zazo had fallen. The Vandals' courage broke. Gelimer watched in disbelief as his army collapsed around him. What had begun as a desperate defense had turned into utter defeat. The last Vandal king fled into the mountains. The battle was over, but the story was not. The fall of a kingdom. In the following days, the Byzantine army pursued scattered Vandal factions, capturing cities, gathering supplies, and restoring order. Africa, once a jewel of the old Western Empire, now returned to Roman control. Belisarius sent word to Justinian. The Vandal kingdom is no more. It was one of the most astonishing military achievements of late antiquity. A single campaign, 2 decisive battles, an ancient kingdom erased, but Belisarius was not finished. He knew Gelimer still wandered in the high mountains of Numidia, refusing to accept defeat. The general sent envoys. He offered mercy. He promised safety. Weeks passed. Despair grew. Hunger tightened its grip. At last, exhausted and broken, Gelimer descended from the mountains, his body thin, his spirit heavy. He surrendered not to a tyrant, but to a commander who treated him with dignity. Belisarius accepted his surrender with calm respect. The war was truly over. Return to Constantinople. With the Vandals defeated, Belisarius gathered his soldiers and prepared for the triumphal return. They boarded ships once more, but this time the mood was different. The breeze felt lighter, the sea calmer, the horizon brighter. The people of Constantinople awaited their hero. For the first time in centuries, an overseas conquest had succeeded completely. As the fleet approached the capital, bells rang. Crowds gathered, voices rose in excitement. Belisarius entered the city not as a mere general, but as the savior of Rome's Western memory. He was young, victorious, and admired by all. Yet even in his moment of triumph, he remained humble. He walked not as a conqueror, but as a servant of the empire. Justinian honored him with a grand triumph. A ceremonial procession through the streets, filled with music, banners, and treasure taken from Carthage. But beneath the celebration, whispers began to circulate. Whispers of jealousy, whispers of suspicion, whispers that the emperor admired Belisarius and feared him. For a general who wins too much becomes a danger to those who rule. But that danger belonged to the future. For now, the empire celebrated, and Belisarius stood at the height of his early glory. The drums of triumph fade. The cheers of Constantinople fall into a gentle echo, and the night settles softly over the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Belisarius, hero of Africa, walks through marble halls lit by golden lamps. His armor has been polished, his banners hang proudly, and yet, somewhere in the shadows of the palace, jealous eyes follow him. To rise so high in such a world is to awaken both admiration and fear. The empire he has served faithfully is about to test his loyalty in ways he could never imagine. The emperor's shadow, Justinian, the powerful ruler who dreamed of restoring Rome, watched Belisarius's meteoric rise with a conflicted heart. He admired him. Yes, Belisarius had done what no general before him had achieved. He had conquered a foreign kingdom swiftly, decisively, brilliantly. But admiration is a fragile thing for an emperor. Power is delicate, and men who shine too brightly cast shadows on the throne. Though Justinian smiled at Belisarius, though he praised him publicly, a small doubt whispered in the emperor's mind. If the army loves him more than they love me, what happens next? This fear would shape their relationship for years. The Empress, Theodora. The woman who saw everything beside Justinian stood Empress Theodora, a woman of immense intelligence and unbreakable will. She understood people, their ambitions, their fears, their secrets. She studied Belisarius carefully. She saw his loyalty. She saw his humility, but she also saw the danger his popularity could pose. And yet, Theodora was not his enemy. In fact, her relationship with him was complicated, interwoven with political alliances, personal trust, and at times, suspicion. But there was one person in the palace who changed everything. Antonina, Belisarius's wife. Antonina, the empress's confidant. Antonina was more than a wife. She was clever, ambitious, charming, and deeply connected to the empress. Theodora trusted her, confided in her, used her influence to shape palace politics. Belisarius loved Antonina fiercely, with a loyalty that mirrored his devotion to the empire itself. But this marriage, this bond between general and wife, would become one of the most dramatic threads in his life. Antonina's ambitions and Theodora's political calculations would influence Belisarius's fate more than any battlefield. For now, though, the general rested, unaware that his greatest victories were still ahead, and his greatest betrayals still waiting. The dream of reconquest expands. With Africa reclaimed, Justinian turned his attention toward an even greater prize. Italy, Rome, the heartland of the ancient empire. Once the center of Western civilization, Italy had fallen under the rule of the Ostrogoths, a powerful, organized, and fiercely independent kingdom. But Justinian believed this kingdom could be reclaimed. He believed Rome itself could shine again, and he believed only one man could achieve such a dream. Belisarius. The order was given, another campaign, another war, another chance to reshape history. The general did not hesitate. He had served before, he would serve again. The long road to Italy. The journey to the next great conquest began not in the quiet of the night, but in the bustling ports of the eastern Mediterranean. Belisarius inspected his troops. Veterans of Africa, fresh recruits, cavalry hardened by desert campaigns, infantry disciplined by years under his command. He studied maps, looked over supply lines, planned routes across seas and coasts. His mind was already on the next battlefield. But Italy was no ordinary land. It was the birthplace of empire, now fractured, divided, and guarded by a proud Gothic nation. They would not yield easily. The Siege of Naples. A test of patience. Belisarius's first major challenge in Italy was the fortified port city of Naples. The walls were high, the defenders determined, the people terrified of war. Belisarius offered peace. He promised protection. He gave the city a chance to surrender with dignity. They refused, so the siege began. Days turned into weeks. The soldiers grew restless, supplies stretched thin. Some advisors urged Belisarius to abandon the effort. But he remained calm. He studied the walls. He studied the tunnels beneath the city. He searched for a weakness hidden in stone and darkness. And then, a narrow aqueduct, just wide enough for a man to crawl through, caught his attention. At night, under strict silence, a small group of soldiers slipped inside the aqueduct, crawling through the damp channel until they reached the heart of the city. When they emerged, the defenders panicked. The gates fell. Naples surrendered. Belisarius entered gently. No unnecessary bloodshed, no chaos, no cruelty. He won Naples not through brute force, but through patience, intelligence, and restraint. This was his signature. This was his genius. The road to Rome. With Naples secured, Belisarius marched north toward the ancient city of Rome. For centuries, Rome had been the center of the Western world. Now, it stood under Gothic rule. Strong, fortified, but politically unstable. The Romans themselves looked anxiously eastward. Some hoped for liberation. Others feared chaos. Belisarius traveled through the countryside with disciplined precision. Villagers watched his army pass with cautious hope. Bishops offered blessings. Cities whispered of his victories in Africa. His reputation moved faster than his soldiers. And when he reached the ancient gates of Rome, something remarkable happened. The city opened its doors. No battle, no siege, no blood. Rome welcomed Belisarius as a liberator. For the first time in many decades, a general of the Eastern Empire entered the Eternal City under banners of peace. It was a symbolic moment, one that shook the Gothic kingdom and electrified the Mediterranean world. But with Rome reclaimed, the true struggle was only beginning, for the Goths would not let their jewels slip away without a fight. The siege was coming, and it would test Belisarius in ways no battlefield ever had. Breathe slowly, let the world grow quiet, and imagine the ancient walls of Rome rising in the pale morning light. Stones worn by centuries, gates older than memory. A city that once ruled the world, now fragile, surrounded, and waiting for a general who refused to surrender to fear. Belisarius stands atop the Aurelian walls, his cloak drifting in the cold winter breeze. Below him, tens of thousands of Gothic warriors gather like a dark sea. Their king, Witiges, has come to reclaim the Eternal City and crush the small Byzantine garrison inside. But Belisarius does not tremble. He studies the enemy lines with calm, reflective eyes. He has only a few thousand soldiers. The Goths have more than 100,000. Logic says the city must fall. History says Rome cannot be held. But Belisarius was never bound by what others believed. The Gothic storm approaches. The Ostrogoths encircled Rome through the winter of 537. They cut the aqueducts, hoping thirst would break the defenders' spirit. They blocked roads, hoping hunger would force surrender. They waited, believing time was the greatest weapon. Inside the city, fear spread quietly. Bread grew scarce, wells ran dry. The people whispered in temples and markets, wondering whether the Byzantines could hold the walls. Belisarius listened to these worries, but he did not let them guide his actions. Instead, he strengthened morale with presence, not speeches. He walked the streets, checked the gates personally, spoke gently with citizens, and made them believe that Rome's fate was not sealed. His calmness became the city's shield. The archers of the walls. The siege began with a thunderous assault. Gothic warriors surged forward with ladders, shields, and rams. Their battle cries echoed across Rome's ancient stones. Belisarius ordered the archers to wait. Not yet. Hold. Now. At his signal, a rain of arrows darkened the sky. The Goths staggered under the barrage but kept pushing. Then Belisarius deployed one of his quiet innovations, concentrated fire. Instead of spreading archers across the wall, he directed them to focus on a single point, breaking the Gothic charge at its strongest section. The attackers faltered. The rams withdrew. The ladders toppled backward into the dust. The first assault had failed, but thousands more waited outside. The Gothic towers. Days later, the Goths returned, this time with towering siege machines rolling slowly toward the gates. These wooden giants, covered in wet hides to resist fire, threatened to breach the walls completely. Belisarius acted instantly. He positioned ballistae, giant crossbows, to fire bolts the size of tree trunks. He lined the walls with stone throwers. He placed his best infantry at the expected breach points. When the towers approached, Rome trembled. Belisarius raised his arm. Strike! Bolts flew. Stones shattered wood. The first tower collapsed in flames. Another burst open under the impact of boulders. Gothic soldiers fled, their machines crumbling around them. Rome still stood. The defenders cheered quietly. But Belisarius remained composed. He knew this was only the beginning. Hunger and hope. Winter tightened its grip. Food dwindled. The Tiber River flowed cold and unforgiving. Belisarius rationed supplies with care. Every loaf of bread mattered. Every grain of wheat held value. He sent small cavalry units to slip through Gothic positions at night, bringing back food and intelligence. These missions were dangerous, but his men trusted him. Their loyalty became the heartbeat of the city. Inside Rome, the people began to see Belisarius not only as a general, but as a guardian figure. Calm, patient, unshaken by fear. Even priests whispered his name in their prayers. The night battle. One of the most dramatic moments of the siege unfolded under the cover of darkness. A Gothic force attempted a secret river crossing, hoping to surprise the Byzantines from the rear. But Belisarius, ever watchful, anticipated the move. He gathered a small group of cavalry and rode out into the moonlit fields. No torches, no banners, only silence. When the Goths reached the riverbank, Belisarius struck first. His cavalry charged with explosive speed, scattering the surprised attackers. The clash of steel echoed across the water. Horses splashed through the river. The moon shimmered on wet armor. It was a small battle, but it carried enormous meaning. Belisarius had shown the Goths that he could see in the dark, predict their movements, and strike like lightning. Fear spread through the enemy camp. The siege drags on. Months passed. Both sides suffered. The Goths struggled with disease, lack of supplies, and fading morale. Belisarius remained vigilant. He repaired walls, constructed new defenses, and launched targeted counterattacks that kept the enemy constantly off balance. Rome endured. Slowly, the balance shifted. The Goths began to doubt. Their great host, so confident at the beginning, found itself drained of strength. Whispers spread in King Witige's camp. Rome cannot be taken. Belisarius is too strong. We must retreat. And then, one cold morning, the Gothic army withdrew. The siege was over. Rome had survived against overwhelming odds. The liberator of Rome. When the gates finally opened and fresh supplies flowed into the city, the people cheered Belisarius with overwhelming gratitude. They called him the defender of Rome, the new Scipio, the restorer of empire. He accepted their praise with humility, though his clothes were worn, his face thin from months of hardship. He did not fight for glory. He fought because it was his duty, because the people needed protection, and because loyalty was the deepest part of his soul. But the war in Italy was far from over. The Goths still held the north. Their fortresses still stood. Their armies still gathered strength. Rome was saved. But the battle for Italy was only entering its next stage. Belisarius prepared himself for the campaign that would define the fate of an entire peninsula. Imagine standing on a city wall, bleeding, exhausted, starving, and below you rises the roar of 100,000 enemies who want your head. That was Belisarius in 537 AD, trapped inside Rome, facing the greatest nightmare of his career. But instead of collapsing, he turned the ancient city into a fortress of legend. This is the moment Belisarius stopped being a general and became a myth. The enemy arrives. The Goths marched south under King Witiges, a hardened warrior with one goal: destroy Belisarius and reclaim Italy. When they reached Rome, they expected panic. They expected surrender. They expected the young Eastern general to flee. They found him waiting at the gates. Belisarius had only 5,000 soldiers. The Goths had more than 20 times that number. A hopeless fight, a sealed fate, a guaranteed defeat. Yet Belisarius whispered to his men, "Rome has fallen many times. Not today. The siege begins." The Goths surrounded Rome completely, blocking supply lines, cutting aqueducts, and choking the city's life. Famine hit hard, diseases spread. People collapsed on the streets. But Belisarius never let fear grow. By day, he inspected the walls. By night, he strengthened them. Every moment, he planned something new. Something clever, surprising, impossible. He ordered towers rebuilt. He trained civilians to haul stones, pour boiling oil, and repair breaches. He turned old monuments into defensive structures, transforming ruins into lethal obstacles. Rome became a puzzle, and every piece was his design. The first assault. The Goths charged with siege towers, battering rams, and ladders stretching like giant wooden skeletons. As the enemy swarmed the walls, Belisarius rode along the ramparts with a bow in hand, firing shot after shot with frightening accuracy. Soldiers watched him and felt their courage ignite. Then came his trap. He ordered archers to hold until the last second. Just as the Goths pressed in tight formations, trying to scale the walls, Belisarius unleashed a storm. Hundreds of arrows rained down. Boiling pitch poured, stones crashed. The enemy ranks collapsed in chaos. The first attack failed. Rome still stood. The Gothic counterstrike humiliated. Witigis changed tactics. He ordered simultaneous attacks across multiple gates, hoping to overwhelm the defenders. Belisarius responded with lightning instincts. He galloped from gate to gate, commanding each defense personally, appearing wherever the enemy pressure was strongest. As if he existed in several places at once, he moved with such speed and precision that his soldiers began calling him the Ghost of the Walls. Every assault failed, every push broke, every attempt was shattered. The Water War. The Goths, furious, attempted a desperate plan. They built dams to flood Rome and drown the defenders. Belisarius predicted it. He struck the dams with a sudden cavalry raid, destroying them before they could unleash destruction. The Goths watched helplessly as their last grand plan collapsed into muddy debris. Victory should bring reward, but in the empire of Justinian, victory brought suspicion. Belisarius had done the impossible. He defended Rome against an army 20 times larger. He became a legend across continents. But legends are dangerous, especially when you're serving a ruler who fears being overshadowed. The hero returns, to whispers and jealousy. When Belisarius returned to Constantinople, the city roared with celebration. People lined the streets. Flowers showered the air. Men saluted, women cheered. Children climbed rooftops just to glimpse the hero of Rome. But in the palace halls, the mood was different. Cold, calculating, cautious. Justinian watched Belisarius with a tight smile. Beside him stood Empress Theodora, far more observant, far more dangerous. Belisarius bowed, the emperor nodded, and behind them, the court whispered, "He is too popular. His soldiers love him more than the emperor. He could lead a revolt." Belisarius heard every whisper, felt every stare, but he pretended not to. He wasn't there for power. He wanted only service, duty, loyalty. But the empire did not believe him. Justinian tests his general. Instead of praise, Justinian offered Belisarius something strange, a smaller army, and a new mission. Not to conquer, not to defend, but to pacify the jealous nobles who feared his growing fame. A test, a trap, a way to keep him busy, and far from the capital. Belisarius understood the message. Serve, but do not shine. Yet he accepted the assignment without hesitation. Duty came before pride. The betrayal begins, whispers turned into accusations. Corrupt courtiers forged documents claiming Belisarius secretly plotted to take the throne. They bribed witnesses, they twisted rumors. Eventually, they brought their lies before Justinian. "Your Majesty, Belisarius seeks the crown." Justinian stared at the forged evidence. His heart raced with fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being eclipsed. But Theodora, she remained calm. She knew something Justinian didn't. Belisarius was loyal to a fault, and too honest to play the palace games. So she proposed a different punishment, not execution, not exile. Something far more humiliating. Reduce his pay, strip his rank, cut his support. The message to Belisarius was clear. You are a tool, not a hero. The general, who stood alone. Belisarius returned home one night to find officials removing the symbols of his rank from his residence. His army reduced, his authority shattered. Most men would have rebelled, others would have fled. He simply sighed and told his wife Antonina, If the emperor commands that I be a soldier with no title, then a soldier I remain. This loyalty stunned even his enemies. The real enemy rises. While Constantinople sank into political chaos, trouble brewed in the east. A powerful empire, an empire Belisarius knew too well, was preparing for war. The Sassanid Persians, led by fierce generals and backed by an army numbering in the tens of thousands, began threatening Byzantine borders again. Cities burned, frontiers collapsed, refugees poured into the empire, and the emperor realized something terrifying. Only one man had ever beaten the Persians on their own soil, Belisarius, the man he had just humiliated. Justinian's dilemma the emperor paced in his chambers. How could he send Belisarius, the man he distrusted, the man accused of treason, to save the empire again? But how could he not send him? The choices were simple. Send Belisarius, or watch the east fall. Theodora leaned in and said quietly, "A great ruler uses every weapon, even those he fears." And with that, Justinian restored Belisarius's command. Not fully, not generously, just enough to send him to war. A last chance, a dangerous mission, a test of loyalty and genius. Belisarius accepts the impossible. He took the appointment without bitterness, without revenge, without hesitation. His soldiers rallied behind him instantly, many returning from distant posts the moment they heard his name. Loyalty like that cannot be commanded, it must be earned. Belisarius mounted his horse, looked east, and whispered, "War again." The sun was rising over the eastern frontier, but for the Byzantine Empire, it felt like the dawn of its darkest hour. Cities smoldered, villages lay in ruins, and the Persian war machine, relentless, disciplined, merciless, was marching toward the heart of the empire. Only one man had ever stopped them. Only one name made Persian commanders hesitate: Belisarius. But the man arriving on the Eastern Front wasn't the unstoppable hero of Rome. He was stripped of rank, underfunded, and betrayed. Yet he rode forward anyway, because the empire needed him. The Persian storm builds the Sassanid Empire, led by King Khosrow Thuritzer, was a titan of the ancient world. Smart, brutal, rich, a strategist equal to any commander alive. His generals prepared siege engines the size of towers. Their cavalry drilled with precise, terrifying coordination. Their elite warriors, immortal infantry, armored horsemen, disciplined archers, were ready to carve through Byzantine lands. And they expected an easy victory. After all, Justinian had weakened Belisarius, giving him barely enough men to defend a single fortress, let alone an entire frontier. But Belisarius didn't complain. He didn't argue. He didn't beg for reinforcements. He simply said, "If we cannot match their numbers, we will break their confidence instead." The art of invisible war. Belisarius knew something the Persians didn't. War is not just about armies. It's about fear, surprise, and illusion. So he began fighting a new kind of war, an invisible one. He scattered small, fast-moving cavalry units across the region. They attacked Persian supply lines, burned their wagons, destroyed bridges, vanished before pursuit. One moment they hit at dawn, the next at midnight. Never in the same place twice. Rumors began spreading. Belisarius commands an army we cannot see. He is everywhere. In truth, he had barely 6,000 men, but to the Persians it felt like 60,000. Through smoke and dust, doubt crept into the Persian ranks. The deadliest weapon Belisarius possessed, the siege of Edessa. The Persians soon targeted the fortress city of Edessa, rich, strategic, and crucial. If it fell, the entire Byzantine frontier would collapse. Khosrow marched with overwhelming numbers. Belisarius arrived with almost nothing. But the people saw him and felt hope ignite. He walked the walls, studied the ground, and built a defense so clever that even the Persians would write about it later. He placed archers in hidden positions where sunlight blinded attackers. He dug traps around battlements. He strengthened towers overnight with wooden cages stuffed with soil. Cheap, fast, nearly indestructible. Then he waited. The first assault. The Persians charged with siege towers and elite infantry. Belisarius commanded from the walls, calm, impossible to shake. When the enemy reached the gates, he unleashed the hidden archers. Arrows exploded downward with lethal accuracy. Persian ranks crumbled. Their towers caught fire. Their infantry fell back in chaos. Edessa held, but Khosrow wasn't done. The giant ram of death. The Persians built a monstrous battering ram, a tower covered with thick hides pushed by dozens of soldiers. It crawled forward like a beast born from fire. Belisarius had expected this. He ordered his men to roll massive millstones from the walls, timed perfectly to smash into the ram's wooden frame. The stones shattered beams, crushed crews, and sent the mighty machine collapsing into dust. Persian morale dropped. The attack faltered. Belisarius had broken their momentum again. The counter-strike of fear. Knowing the Persians were shaken, Belisarius struck with psychological warfare. He released messages claiming a massive Byzantine army was only days away, ready to crush them. The rumors spread like wildfire. Scouts reported shadows that looked like marching columns. Villagers whispered of cavalry movements at night. Even Khosrow began to suspect a trap. Finally, after weeks of trying to breach the city, the Persians withdrew. Edessa was safe. And Belisarius. Once again, he had defeated an empire without needing an empire-sized force. Justinian's response. The news reached Constantinople. Belisarius had turned weakness into victory. He had saved the frontier. He had humiliated Persia. Again. And Justinian. He felt something strange. Relief, admiration, and fear. The more victories Belisarius achieved, the more dangerous he seemed in the emperor's eyes. A hero is always one step from becoming a threat. Rome was free, but freedom never lasts long in a land ruled by war. After Belisarius left Italy, the Goths rose again, stronger, angrier, more organized than before. New leaders united them, cities rebelled. Roman nobles switched sides, and Justinian's mistakes turned victory into chaos. Italy was burning, and only one name echoed through the collapsing peninsula. Bring back Belisarius. The emperor's hesitation. Justinian sat on his golden throne, swirling between pride and panic. Calling Belisarius again would save Italy, but it would also give the general another chance to win the love of the people. And emperors fear nothing more than a hero they cannot control. For days he delayed. Weeks passed. Cities fell. Finally, shamed by reports of Gothic victories, he reopened the only door left. Belisarius's door. A messenger arrived with the order. Return to Italy. Restore imperial control. But the message came with a cruel twist. Justinian gave him almost no soldiers, no fresh resources, no money, no supplies. Belisarius was to save Italy with an army smaller than a gladiator school. The general who refused to break others would have refused the mission. Others would have demanded reinforcements. Belisarius simply nodded. He gathered his loyal veterans, the men who had followed him through Persia, Africa, and Rome. Men who would follow him into hell. They boarded ships and crossed the Mediterranean, not as an army, but as a handful of warriors returning to a battlefield that had swallowed thousands. When Belisarius landed in Italy, the people didn't see weakness. They didn't see numbers. They saw the man who saved Rome once before. Hope returned, a land full of enemies. Gothic armies roamed everywhere. Fortresses had fallen, roads were unsafe. Cities defected to the Goths whenever food was scarce. Even worse, many Byzantine commanders in Italy hated Belisarius. They envied him. They feared being overshadowed. Some even hoped he would lose. These allies refused to send troops. Others refused to follow orders. A few openly sabotaged him. Belisarius realized he wasn't fighting one war, but two. The ghost strategy returns. With tiny numbers and massive enemies, Belisarius returned to the tactics that once terrified Persia. Speed, camouflage, night raids, deception. He attacked Gothic patrols at dawn, vanished into forests, liberated small towns, turned villages into strategic outposts. He used the rumor of his own legend as a weapon. Gothic scouts returned to their leaders trembling. He moves faster than expected. He strikes from nowhere. We never know where he'll be. Soon, whole Gothic forces hesitated to march at night, afraid they'd run into the invisible general. The liberation of Rome. Again, Rome had fallen once more into Gothic hands, and every soldier inside believed the city was unbreakable. But Belisarius saw a weakness. He analyzed the walls, the river, the guards, the gate rotations. He found a small section where guards grew careless every night, a sliver of vulnerability in a fortress of stone. At midnight during a storm, Belisarius struck. His men climbed the walls silently. The thunder masked their footsteps. Within minutes, the outer guards were neutralized. Then they opened the gates. Belisarius walked into Rome not with a roaring army, but with a whisper. And the city fell without a single grand battle. The people woke to find Gothic banners replaced with imperial standards, and Belisarius standing calmly at the gates. He had taken Rome, with fewer soldiers than a farmer's militia. The court's reaction in Constantinople, the news spread like wildfire. Belisarius has freed Rome again. Belisarius controls Italy. Belisarius wins with nothing. Justinian froze. He couldn't decide whether to celebrate or worry. The more victories Belisarius earned, the more dangerous he looked. A general adored by soldiers, loved by the people, respected by enemies. To an insecure emperor, that is not a hero. That is a threat. The final blow from the palace. Just as Belisarius gained momentum, something happened that struck harder than any Gothic sword. Justinian suddenly cut his funding. Again, without warning. No pay, no supplies, no reinforcements. If Belisarius wanted to win, he would have to do it alone. Italy could be saved, or it could collapse. But Belisarius's greatest enemy was no longer the Goths. It was the empire he served. He reclaimed Rome. He restored hope. He revived an empire that tried to forget him. But victories mean nothing when the hand that commands you is the same hand that fears you. Belisarius was about to fight the most tragic chapter of his life. A war he could win, with an empire determined to make him lose. A general with no support. Italy was a battlefield of starvation and shadows. Cities were dying, allies were unreliable. The Goths were spreading like wildfire under a fierce and brilliant king, Totila. Totila was everything an emperor feared, charismatic, ruthless, adored by his warriors. He united the Gothic tribes, restored discipline, promised revenge. And when he heard Belisarius had returned, he smiled and said, "At last, a worthy opponent." But Totila had something Belisarius didn't: an army, supplies, money, political unity. Belisarius had loyalty. But loyalty doesn't feed soldiers. The soldiers began to starve as winter hit. Belisarius's army crumbled. Food vanished, armor rusted, horses died, men deserted, not out of fear but out of hunger. Reinforcements from Constantinople? None. Pay from the emperor? Cut. Basic supplies? Denied. Justinian's message was clear. Win the war, but do not become too powerful. The trap was tightening. Totila's thunder rises. The Gothic king seized fortress after fortress. He destroyed garrisons. He burned Roman estates. He retook towns Belisarius had liberated. He marched with confidence, not because he was stronger, but because he sensed something deeper. Belisarius was being strangled by his own emperor. Totila even sent him a message. "You are a lion in chains. Break them, and we shall see who rules Italy." Belisarius ignored the taunt. He stayed loyal. Painfully, stubbornly, tragically loyal. The Battle of Mugello. A war without war. Totila wanted a decisive showdown. He marched toward the Mugello Valley, setting the stage for a clash that could decide Italy's fate. Belisarius arrived with a handful of cavalry, starving, exhausted, under-equipped. He scouted Totila's army and understood immediately, if he fought here, his entire army would die. So he didn't fight. Instead, he performed one of the most brilliant withdrawals in ancient warfare. He retreated slowly, deliberately, in perfect discipline, never turning his back, never panicking, never giving Totila the opening he wanted. Totila watched in awe as Belisarius slipped through his fingers like mist through iron. Even without fighting, Belisarius outclassed him. But Italy needed victories, not escapes. The emperor's final sabotage. Belisarius wrote to Justinian, "Send supplies, send money, send even a single ship, or Italy will fall." The emperor delayed again, sent excuses, then sent nothing. Not a sword, not a shield, not a coin. Some historians claim Justinian feared that if Belisarius won again, he would become too beloved. Others say corrupt officials convinced him that Italy was not worth saving. Either way, the empire abandoned its greatest general in the middle of a burning battlefield. Belisarius stands alone. Starving soldiers approached him. "General, we have no food." "General, our spears are broken." "General, our armor is falling apart." Belisarius had no answers. He rode through his camp, saw men dying without battle, saw officers weeping quietly, saw veterans who once stood against Persia now too weak to lift a shield. The world's greatest general was fighting a war against poverty, not enemies, and no genius could defeat that. The last attempt. Desperate to keep morale alive, Belisarius launched one last bold raid. He struck Totila's supply lines, burned wagons, captured horses, rescued civilians. For a moment, hope flickered. Rumors spread, Belisarius is rising again. The old fire is returning. But without support, he couldn't hold the momentum. His tiny victories were washed away in the ocean of Rome's collapse. The summons that broke him. Then came the final blow. A letter from Constantinople. Belisarius, return to the capital. No thanks, no honor, no praise, just a dismissal. A quiet way to pull him out of Italy without acknowledging the empire's failure. Belisarius read the order slowly. Then he folded the parchment, mounted his horse, and rode away. Italy collapsed within months. Without Belisarius, there was nothing to stop Totila. Rome fell again, cities surrendered. Italy was lost, not because Belisarius failed, but because he was never given a chance to win. The general who refused to break Belisarius had faced enemies from every direction. Persians in the east, Vandals in Africa, Goths in Italy, but now he faced something far more dangerous. A war he wasn't allowed to win. Because back in Constantinople, rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers in palace corridors. Accusations floating through the Senate. And Justinian, once his closest ally, began to wonder. Has Belisarius become too powerful? But while political knives sharpened behind his back, Belisarius kept marching forward, driven by one mission: restore Rome, piece by piece. In Italy, the war twisted into a nightmare. Cities starved, armies crumbled. The Gothic king Totila rose from the chaos, a brilliant warrior, charismatic, fearless, a leader who inspired the broken remnants of the West. And for the first time in years, Rome trembled. Belisarius arrived like a ghost returning from legend. His mere presence changed the battlefield. Soldiers whispered, "The old commander is back." He found Rome starving, beaten, and surrounded. The Goths blockaded every gate, cut every supply line, and waited for the Eternal City to kneel. But Belisarius didn't kneel. He rebuilt defenses with scraps of timber. He trained starving civilians to fight with slings and sharpened tools. He returned hope to a city that had forgotten what hope felt like. Then, one night, Totila struck. A full assault. A storm of arrows. A roar of warriors shaking ancient stone. Belisarius climbed the walls himself, torch in hand, shouting over the chaos, Hold the line. Rome will not fall tonight. The defenders fought like wolves cornered by fire, and somehow, against all odds, Rome survived. But the victory wasn't enough. Belisarius wrote letter after letter begging Justinian for reinforcements, for gold, for manpower, for anything that could end the war decisively. Silence. The emperor sent nothing, not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't. Belisarius was winning too much, and in the highest palace in the world, that was a problem. Still, the general didn't break. He kept the Gothic army at bay. He protected civilians. He prolonged the life of Rome itself. But even legends have limits. Even heroes grow tired. And soon, Belisarius would face the most devastating betrayal of his life. A wound not made by sword or spear, but by the very empire he had saved. The betrayal that shook an empire. Belisarius had survived impossible wars. Persian cavalry, Vandal fleets, Gothic legions, yet none of them wounded him like this, because now the blade pointed at him came from within Constantinople itself. While Rome bled in the west, Justinian grew suspicious in the east. Advisors whispered poison. Belisarius wants the throne. He's more loved than the emperor. His victories make him dangerous. And Justinian listened. So when Belisarius begged for reinforcements, the emperor sent nothing but excuses. The general who once rebuilt empires was now forced to fight with scraps. Totila, bold and relentless, saw his chance. The Goths retook city after city. Not because Belisarius failed, but because his own empire refused to let him succeed. Still, Belisarius held the line. He blocked Totila's advance. He saved thousands of civilians. He bought time, but time ran out. A message finally arrived from Constantinople. Not reinforcements, not gold, not gratitude. A summons. Belisarius was ordered to return home immediately. No explanation, no honors, just a cold demand. When he arrived in the capital, he expected celebration, recognition, or at least respect. Instead, he was met with chains. Accused of corruption, accused of treason, accused of crimes he never committed. The greatest general of the empire, the man who had rebuilt Justinian's world, was stripped of command, his wealth seized, his reputation shattered. And for what? For loyalty. For victory, for being too good at his job. Whispers spread through the empire. Has Justinian imprisoned Belisarius? Is this the end of Rome's last great general? Even the soldiers who once followed him couldn't believe it. But Belisarius, even humiliated, even broken, never rebelled, never raised a blade against the emperor who betrayed him. Instead, he waited, quietly, patiently, because fate wasn't finished with him yet. And soon, when the empire faced one final terrible threat, the world would need Belisarius again. Whether Justinian liked it or not, years passed, empires shifted, enemies rose in the shadows. And Belisarius, once the brightest star of Rome, lived in forced silence, a legend gathering dust. But legends don't die. They wait, and one day the waiting ended. A new danger erupted on the empire's northern frontier. A wave of Slavic and Bulgar raiders, ruthless, relentless, burning towns, shattering borders, pushing deeper toward Constantinople itself. Panic spread through the capital. The walls trembled with fear. And even Justinian realized there was only one man who could save them. So the emperor sent a message. Hesitant, awkward, almost ashamed. Belisarius, return to service. No apology, no explanation. Just a desperate plea. Most men would have refused. Most men would have reminded Justinian of the chains, the humiliation, the betrayal. But Belisarius wasn't most men. He stood, old but unbroken, scarred but sharp, and answered with the same loyalty he'd carried his entire life. I will serve. He gathered what few troops he could find. A small force, hardly an army, and marched out to meet an invasion that had swallowed entire provinces. Battlefields he once dominated were now filled with new enemies, new tactics, new horrors. But Belisarius fought like a force of nature. He deployed ambushes in fog-covered passes. He used broken cavalry to create the illusion of a much larger army. He outmaneuvered raiders with strategies only he could invent. And against all logic, the invasion slowed, then stopped, then collapsed entirely. Belisarius had done it again. He saved the empire with almost nothing. The people erupted in celebration. Crowds filled the streets chanting his name. Old veterans wept, remembering the man who had led them through impossible wars. But in the palace, Justinian said nothing. No rewards, no monuments. Not even a simple thank you. Because even now, even after Belisarius saved his empire twice, the emperor still feared one thing: Belisarius's greatness. But fate, as always, had a final twist waiting. A twist that would turn the legend of Belisarius from history. The fall of a legend. Belisarius had survived battles that destroyed kingdoms. He had restored empires, saved cities, reshaped history. Yet the final blow of his life came not from sword or spear, but from politics. Cold, silent, merciless. Whispers returned to Constantinople, old enemies resurfaced. And one rumor spread like poison. Belisarius is plotting to overthrow Justinian. It wasn't true. Everyone knew it wasn't true. But truth didn't matter. Fear did. And Justinian, aging, paranoid, and surrounded by schemers, listened once again. The order came swiftly, brutally. Belisarius was arrested, again. But this time, the charges were heavier. High treason. The penalty? Death crowds gathered in shock. Even senators who despised him couldn't understand what they were witnessing. The man who had rebuilt Justinian's empire was now paraded like a criminal. A trial followed. A mockery of justice where lies drowned out loyalty, and decades of service meant nothing. Belisarius stood silent, enduring the accusations with the same calm dignity he carried on the battlefield. And then came the verdict. Guilty, but Justinian hesitated. Execution would make him look weak, cruel, ungrateful. So instead, he ordered something far more symbolic, far more humiliating. Belisarius was stripped of wealth, stripped of command, stripped of honor, and according to legend, even stripped of sight. Left to wander the streets of Constantinople as a beggar, a cup in his hand, a cloak over his eyes, and a voice whispering, "Give alms to Belisarius, whom virtue has abandoned." Historians debate the truth, whether he was truly blinded or merely disgraced. But the story, true or not, reveals something deeper. Even the greatest hero of Rome was not safe from the empire he saved. Yet, here's the tragedy's final twist. Even after all of this, even after humiliation, betrayal, and undeserved suffering, Belisarius never turned bitter, never sought revenge, never cursed Justinian's name. He remained loyal until his final breath, a general unmatched in skill, a servant unmatched in loyalty, a man unmatched in history. But his story wasn't finished yet, because the end of Belisarius would reveal something no emperor could hide. The final dawn of a forgotten hero. Belisarius's last years were quiet. Almost too quiet for a man who once commanded continents. No armies, no thundering cavalry, no roaring crowds, just an old general living in the shadow of an emperor he had made immortal. But history has a way of correcting its mistakes, because when Justinian neared the end of his own life, something unexpected happened. A flicker of conscience, or maybe fear of how the world would judge him. The emperor reversed the accusations, restored Belisarius's property, cleared his name. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Belisarius, worn by betrayal and years of silence, accepted the apology without anger, without pride, without triumph. Just a quiet nod, because he never served for glory. He never fought for statues or titles. He fought for Rome, even when Rome didn't fight for him. Soon after, Belisarius passed away. No grand parade, no golden funeral. But the people The ordinary men and women he had protected mourned him like a king. And centuries later, when scholars asked, who was the greatest general of the Byzantine Empire? Only one name rose above all others. Not Justinian, not Narses, not any emperor or politician, Belisarius. The man who won wars he wasn't allowed to win. The man who saved an empire twice. The man who stayed loyal even when loyalty cost him everything. His legend grew far beyond his lifetime. Artists painted him as the tragic hero of Rome. Poets compared him to Achilles. Historians called him the last great Roman. But maybe the truest description is the simplest. Belisarius was the kind of leader every empire wants, and the kind of leader every empire destroys. His story ends not with a battle cry, but with a lesson whispered across centuries. Greatness is fragile, loyalty is dangerous, and heroes, real heroes, rarely die in glory. They die in truth.